To show how this kind of thinking has been picked up by contemporary writers, let me quote from Gilbert Norwood's book, a standard book, Greek Tragedy, where we are told of Oedipus, he is the best drawn character in Sophocles, not specially virtuous, not specially wise. This seems to me to be an almost total misunderstanding of the play. And while certainly Aristotle himself doesn't quite put it that way, it seems to me that he has led us somewhat on the wrong track. Of course, if you ask about Oedipus, whether he has any hamartia, whether he has any flaws, or whether he ever makes any errors of judgment, the answer would clearly be yes. And if you would ask about his flaws, I suppose the most obvious one is the one I have already pointed to, namely that he has a way of becoming very, very angry, perhaps rather too easily. And you may then say that's how he killed his father in the first place. You may add, of course, he didn't know that it was his father, but why kill any man? It's bad enough, even if it had not been his father, that he should have got so angry at the crossroads that he killed a man. But I dare say the Greeks did not look at it that way. If it had not been his father, it would, for their moral feeling, have been perfectly all right. And while it's true that Oedipus has this tendency of getting very angry, and certainly also is a very, very stubborn man, I think it would be a great mistake to suppose that this flaw, that this failing, somehow is the clue to the tragedy, that this is the solution to the riddle of Oedipus in the sense in which I am using that tonight. What I mean by the riddle of Oedipus is not the riddle of the Sphinx that Oedipus solved, a riddle that is not expounded at all in Sophocles' treatment that he leaves out. But what I mean by the riddle of Oedipus is rather, why does this play, that is rather short and that may strike one as rather plain and uncomplicated, have this singular fascination for the human mind? And what I shall now try to do, in terms of 5 points, is suggest to you a more philosophical approach, at least I think that's what it is, than that of Aristotle. An approach that tries to get at the experience of life that a great poet, Sophocles, projects in his treatment of the story. The first point is the one mentioned by Bauer, that it is a play about man's insecurity. To quote Bauer once more, it is a warning not so much against pride as against any confidence or sense of security. That seems to me to be admirably put, but I would not stress the gods as much as Bauer does, although I'm not sure whether it might not perhaps have been Sophocles' intent. But this theology, putting it in terms of the gods, is merely one way of intellectualizing an experience of life that does not at all depend on this particular articulation in terms of gods. The point is that it is not a fatedness, not a singular case, not something extreme and unrepresentative, but rather Oedipus represents all of us. And what the poet offers us is a universal insight into the human condition, and that constitutes the greatness of the play and seems to me to be the secret of its effect. One might say, well, I'm not like Oedipus. My situation is quite different. And I imagine Sophocles as saying to us, well, how do you know? Surely Oedipus, through most of the play, not only thinks, but tells us that his situation is different. He will not listen to people who tell him that he is in a very precarious position. And Oedipus was exceptionally intelligent. He was the only one who guessed the Sphinx riddle about the human condition. He was, in the words of line 33 of the play, near the beginning, the first of men. Not a divinity, as we are told there, not a divinity, but the first of men. This does not sound like an intermediate personage, the first of men. And what the play is about is the sudden, unexpected fall from happiness and success of even the very first of men. And this always has an exceptional impact, as we realize so very well just now, when utterly unexpectedly, in a way that nobody had thought of or foreseen, somebody who in some ways was the first of men is suddenly brought down. That is something that to millions of people all over the world comes so much as a shock because they feel that it affects them too. And somehow in such a situation one does feel something of what, according to the New York Times about a week ago, a woman in Hungary said, "What is to become of all of us?" And I think this reaction is absolutely of the bone of a tragedy like that of Oedipus. That as one witnesses it, one has the feeling that that woman in Hungary and millions of others had at the same time about a week ago, though they may not have articulated it quite the way she did. What is to become of all of us? This is not, I think, going too far with just one play, with this one line, the first of men to go on. There are similar suggestions at the end of the play. But if one is not too sure in such a case whether one reads one's own experience of the moment or one's own ideas, one's own outlook into a poet, surely the best way of defending against that possibility is to look at the poet's other works. And it seems to me that this is a theme that we encounter in several of the others as well. Let's turn for a moment to the ending of Sophocles' Ajax. Ajax in that play commits suicide after having disgraced himself. He meant to kill Agamemnon and Menelaus. Pallas Athena sent madness upon him and he slaughtered a lot of cattle instead. He cannot bear the shame and he kills himself. It would be easy to view Ajax as a man who, of course, didn't want to kill the cattle, but who was a wretch if he wanted to kill Agamemnon and Menelaus while they were sleeping. But again, this is not the way Sophocles would have us look on it. Sophocles wants for his Ajax all the primeval glory that Ajax has as a heroic figure in the Iliad. And so the play ends with his brother saying of Ajax, "Since time began, there lived on earth no nobler man." And the chorus says, "Wisdom still by seeing grows, but no man the unseen knows. Shall he fare or ill or well, who of mortals can foretell?" Or without the jingles, in another translation, "This man of perfect excellence, no nobler one has ever been than he." The same superlative, a man of perfect excellence, no nobler one has ever been than he. And then the chorus, "What men have seen, they know, but what shall come hereafter, no man before the event can see, nor what end waits for him." This, I suggest, is part of Sophocles' experience of life. That even the very greatest, even the very noblest, not intermediate personages, but the greatest that the world have ever seen, may from one moment to the next be felled, and this should teach us a sense of radical insecurity. Let's turn to yet another play, The Trachinian Women, by Sophocles. It's the play in which Heracles' end is related. Heracles, on whom the Greeks looked as a great savior, as a great redeemer figure. Here too we are told, slaying the noblest man who ever lived, whose peer thou never shalt behold again. And then a little later, and if any man counts on the morrow, he reckons rashly. Then in the end, we are blameless, this jingling translation again, the Loeb translation, which is very literal, but with the jingles. We are blameless, but confess that the gods are pitiless. Children they beget, and claim worship in a father's name, yet with apathetic eye look upon such agony. What is yet to be, none knows, but the present's fraught with woes, woes for us, for them, the gods, deep shame. And of all beneath the sun, worse than he hath suffered none. Come, maidens, come away. Horror have ye seen this day, dire death and direr fall, and Zeus has wrought it all. These considerations, of course, also throw a great deal of light on the Antigone, in which people have searched for a tragic flaw in the character of Antigone. It is quite in line with my interpretation of the Oedipus Rex to agree with Hegel when he says of Antigone that she is the most wonderful human being that ever appeared on earth. In fact, he says a little more strongly than the most wonderful human being, die herrlichste Gestalt, die je auf Erden erschien, the most wonderful being that ever was on earth. Secondly, the Oedipus Tyrannus is a play about man's blindness. In the end, Oedipus is blind, and he blinds himself, obviously, because he finally sees what he had been blind to all the time when he had his eyes. And so far from being an inconceivable stretch of the imagination, a far-fetched point, it seems to me that one only has to mention it to make it perfectly obvious. There's the blind seer Tiresias, who is literally blind but who sees, while Oedipus, who has eyes, cannot see his own situation. And then, as I say, when Oedipus sees, he blinds himself. This blindness is most powerfully perhaps brought home to us in the terrible curse that I have mentioned before, which is also one of the greatest examples of tragic irony in world literature. Sophocles abounds in irony. Let this one passage serve as an example. Oedipus has been told that the plague rages in Thebes because the slayer of Laius has not been found. And now he says, mind you, I speak as one who comes a stranger to this report, no less than to the crime. For how unaided could I track it far without a clue? Which lacking, for too late was I enrolled a citizen of Thebes? This proclamation I address to all, Thebans. If any knows the man by whom Laius, son of Labdacus, was slain, I summon him to make clean shrift to me, and if he shrinks, let him reflect that thus confessing he shall escape the capital charge, for the worst penalty that shall befall him is banishment. Unscathed he shall depart. But if an alien from a foreign land be known to any as the murderer, let him who knows speak out, and she shall have due recompense from me and thanks to boot. But if ye still keep silence, if through fear for self or friends ye disregard my hest, hear what I then resolve. I lay my ban on the assassin, whosoe'er he be. Let no man in this land whereof I hold the sovereign rule harbor or speak to him. Give him no part in prayer or sacrifice or lustral rites, but hound him from your homes, for this is our defilement, so the God hath lately shown to me by oracles. Thus, as their champion, I maintain the cause both of the God and of the murdered king. and for myself, if with my privity he gain admittance to my hearth, I pay the curse I laid on others fall on me. See that ye give effect to all my hest, for my sake and the gods and for our land, a desert blasted by the wrath of heaven, for that alone the gods express command, it were scandal you should leave unpurged the murder of a great man and your king, nor track it home. And now that I am Lord, successor to his throne, his bed, his wife, and had he not been frustrate in the hope of issue, common children of one womb had forged a closer bond twixt him and me, but fate swooped down upon him. Therefore I, his blood avenger, will maintain his cause, as though he were my sire, and leave no stone unturned to track the assassin or avenge the son of Labdacus, of Polydor, of Cadmus, and Aegina, first of the race. When Oedipus talks with Tiresias, this theme of blindness that overwhelms the audience when they hear it is articulated when Oedipus calls Tiresias blind in ear, wit, eye, in everything. Now, what is Oedipus especially blind to? Those whom he loves most. His wife, his mother, his children. He who understood the human condition so well that he was able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx is blind when it comes to his relation to those closest to him. This I have suggested in my book, The Faith of a Heretic. Section 83 is the real paradox of love. That there is a sense in which it is hardest to love those with understanding, that is, whom we love most, those who are closest to us. Assuming, that is, that love involves understanding. It is most difficult, in a way, to understand those who are closest to oneself, because one is oneself so involved in them. I think this may be one of the implications of Freud's relations to Ferenczi and Otto Rank, who later seceded from him, and of whom Ernest Jones pointed out in his 3-volume biography with some glee that they wouldn't have seceded from him if they hadn't been such very, very sick people, without realizing that in this way he suggested that Freud, the great doctor, did not realize how sick 2 of his very closest friends were. This might bear out what I have said, that the man who is able to understand the human condition so exceptionally well is somehow blind when it comes to the people closest to him. And here again, the greatness of the play and of its effect on us may be in part due to the fact that this is such a representative failing. The play is not only a play about man's insecurity and man's blindness, it is also a play about honesty and the curse of honesty. What I mean by honesty is not quite the same as what people mean by sincerity. Some people are able to persuade themselves that they have said what they didn't say, or that they didn't say what in fact they said, and they have all the earmarks of sincerity as they say these things. There's some lack of scruple, which can even be cultivated. Some people are masters of this art of telling falsehoods with sincerity. What I mean by honesty is taking great pains to find things out and to get things straight. There may be cases where it is very doubtful whether somebody is entirely honest or not. Certainly it's possible to be mistaken but honest. But there are degrees of honesty, just as there are degrees of courage. And sometimes we can say of somebody he is exceptionally courageous. And in that sense we can say that Oedipus is exceptionally honest. he is outstanding in his honesty, not only in his knowledge. Being able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, that's a matter of wisdom and knowledge. But again and again, we get illustrations of Oedipus' honesty. Not only illustrations of it, but it is his honesty that keeps the plot moving. Once told that the plague will not disappear unless they find out who is the man who killed Laius, nothing can dissuade him from trying to get at the truth. Again and again it is suggested to him that these things better be left in darkness, that it is a mistake for him to try to find out too much, that finding out the truth will lead to suffering, that will lead to suffering for him. But this is what elicits his immense anger. What makes him so angry with Tiresias and with Creon is that they would hush up something, and he wants the truth at no matter what pains. And he tells us at one point, line 780 following, and this again is crucial for the whole story, that in Corinth once, as a man had drunken too much, he insulted Oedipus and told him that he was not really the son of the people that he thought were his parents, the king and queen of Corinth. And he swallowed the insult, not an easy thing for Oedipus as we are confronted with his temper, and resolves that he is going to get the truth of this. So the next morning he tells us he asked his father and mother. And when they wouldn't tell him, he went to the oracle, and the deceitful oracle told him the truth once again in such a way as to mislead him. All his life long he tries to be uncompromising in his honesty. And he's furious at all who obstruct this quest for honesty. And that is part of his greatness, and that surely is part of his claim to our awed admiration. But, and this is part of Sophocles' greatness, he does not say honesty is the best policy, which is cheap wisdom. He says, in effect, that honesty does not always make the honest man happy. He may, as Oedipus does, benefit others, but he, through his honesty, becomes alienated from all, isolated, driven to despair, and this too, perhaps, is representative. One would expect honesty to tear down barriers, to tear down prejudice and misunderstanding and make men brothers, and it would do just that, perhaps, if all men were honest, but in fact, honesty isolates. The old story of Oedipus wasn't a story about honesty at all, but was part of the greatness of Sophocles that he made it the tragedy of honesty. Fourthly, it is a play about a tragic situation in which, in a very real sense, tragedy, from the very opening, is inevitable. Honesty, of course, is not condemned. If Oedipus gave up his quest, he would fail his people. The plague would rage on and keep killing his people. His honesty is meant to benefit them and does benefit them, but it benefits them at the cost of destroying not only Oedipus himself, but also all of those closest to him, Jocasta, who kills herself, and his children, whose lives are completely and utterly spoiled. But whatever he does in the situation in which we find him from the start, he incurs terrible guilt. If he does not search, guilt toward his people. If he does search, toward those closest to him. And this too can be representative. Perhaps there is a sense in which all of us cannot satisfy all the claims that we should meet. Perhaps this is a chronic feature of the human condition. And occasionally we are in situations in which this inability to meet all legitimate claims on us is quite especially dramatic. And Sophocles adapted this story to make of it a prime example of this. And finally, in addition to being a play about man's insecurity and man's blindness and the curse of honesty and the inevitability of tragedy, it is also a play about the problem of justice, in more sense than one. One asks oneself, is Oedipus' destruction just? Does he deserve it? To this the answer seems to be clearly no. He has faults, but he so clearly gets worse than he deserves. Like Lear, like Antigone. These disasters that come to him are by no means just connected with his faults, but precisely also with his passion for honesty and his intolerance of dishonesty and his righteous, just indignation at the criminal. So there is in the first place the problem of the injustice of the fate of men. There is secondly the question to what extent we are responsible for our fate. And then in a very important sense the play calls human justice into question too, not only the justice of the gods or the justice of fate. Think again of Oedipus' curse that I read you. His desire to punish the criminal, his desire to punish Tiresias and Creon. In every one of those instances, the special construction of the plot by Sophocles makes us feel as, but for Sophocles, we might not feel in the light of this story. Is this justice really such a good thing? Isn't there something terrible? Isn't there something tragic? Isn't there something awesome about justice? And when Jocasta hangs herself, which is her just self-punishment, when Oedipus blinds himself as self-punishment, aren't we led to reflect on just punishment in general? Aren't we led to question whether there is justice in punishment? No alternative solution is proposed, but the dark side of justice is exposed, as it rarely has been in so short a work of literature. We usually assume that justice is quite unproblematically good. Sophocles shows us that it is terribly problematic, and again, this is part of the greatness of the play and of its effect. In conclusion, I still want to do something that is a little different. Plato suggested in his Republic and his Laws a number of points. One I'll quote: "Strip what the poet has to say of its poetical coloring, and you must have seen what it comes to in plain prose. It's like a face that was never really handsome when it has lost the fresh bloom of youth." A beautifully put point, very just, I think, against most poets, but not against Sophocles. Secondly, he suggested that poets do merely what pleases the multitude and reproduce conventional opinions. Very just about many poets, but not about Sophocles. And thirdly, he suggested that poetry is merely the imitation of appearances and something unreal. And that surely doesn't seem right about this play by Sophocles. Plato offered some specific prescriptions that conflict with Sophocles' practice as we have seen it tonight. He says that the divine in literature should be made responsible for good only and never for evil, and he said that the divine never deceives and must not be allowed to deceive in literature. Sophocles has the divine responsible for evil and lets the oracle deceive. And Plato says that virtue must be rewarded in literature, and that goodness must be shown always also to be, among other things, more pleasant, and I have tried to show how that is not so in Sophocles. And Plato said that one should compel the poets to write only about men who are in every way good. Sophocles did not do that. But now there is something very odd. If we look on Sophocles as educator and ask ourselves, here is Sophocles who broke all the Platonic canons for literature. What is the result of his breaking these canons? He teaches us humility, a radical sense of insecurity and of our own blindness, a humility that is just the opposite of Plato's trust in himself and his own rational vision. Secondly, Sophocles teaches us that virtue and happiness are not Siamese twins, as Socrates and Plato taught. And thirdly, he makes us see that morality is profoundly problematic, while Plato, perhaps rather naively, trusted in the compatibility of all the virtues and the desirability of making everybody just as virtuous as possible. But let me end this lecture with a final reversal of the roles I have just assigned to Sophocles and Plato. If, after all this, you look at Sophocles as educator, you can perhaps, after all, understand those very strange estimates with which I began and with which I still so profoundly disagree. I think Sophocles as educator probably is somewhat sedative. Not that the play is sedative, nothing could be more upsetting, but the final wisdom that comes out of it is perhaps a counsel of moderation, of accommodation, of resignation. By celebrating the hero who goes to the opposite extreme, he probably leads the audience to conclude that it is better to lie low. Plato, on the other hand, sets up societies in the Republic and in the laws in which moderation, accommodation, temperance are all held high as norms, and Sophoclean tragedy is forbidden. But somehow Plato's readers are for the most part much more affected by his own refusal to resign himself and to accommodate himself and to be moderate, by his own radicalism, by Plato's Oedipian spirit. And perhaps it takes a reader trained by Plato to read Sophocles the way I have done.